There is a specific kind of person who, when someone offers to buy their old car, goes quiet in a way that has nothing to do with the negotiation. They look at the car. They look at the money. And they say no. Not defensively. Not angrily. Just no. With a finality that confuses people, that gets written off as sentiment or stubbornness or a failure to understand basic economics. But the people doing the writing off are looking at the wrong thing. They're evaluating a transaction. What they're actually witnessing is something closer to an identity statement. The car isn't really a car anymore. It hasn't been for years. Psychologists have a name for part of what's happening. They call it the endowment effect. The moment something becomes yours, your brain begins valuing it differently, not slightly differently, dramatically differently. People consistently demand far more to give something up than they would ever pay to acquire that same thing. The ownership changes the math at a level below conscious reasoning. But that's only the surface of it. That explains a coffee mug or a jacket. It doesn't explain the person standing in the driveway looking at 20 years. Because what accumulates in a car over that kind of time isn't just ownership. It's architecture. The drive home from the job that changed everything. The night that went too late in a city you're not sure you should have been in. The back seat on every trip where the kids were small and the years felt infinite. At some point the vehicle stops being a way to get somewhere and starts being a record of everywhere you've already been. The brain doesn't store that as information. It stores it as sensation. The particular sound of that engine. The seat worn into a shape that fits exactly one person. The smell on a hot afternoon that arrives before memory does and delivers the memory without asking permission. Neuroscientists will tell you that sensory experience is the most direct route into emotional memory. Car people figured this out without the research. There is also nostalgia, which has been misunderstood for most of its history. It was treated for a long time as weakness. Regression. An inability to move forward. But the psychology is more interesting than that. Nostalgia, when researchers actually studied it, turned out to serve a specific function. It maintains what they call self-continuity. The sense that the person you are now is meaningfully connected to the person you have been. That your life is not a series of disconnected episodes but something with coherence, a shape that holds together. In a world built for obsolescence, where everything is designed to be replaced, that sense of continuity is not nostalgia for its own sake. It is resistance. The old car that has outlasted everything around it is not an embarrassment. It is proof. It says, I was here then. I am still here. I am still that person. To sell it is, in some quiet way, to agree that you aren't. And then there is what behavioral economists call loss aversion, which sounds technical until you feel it. Losses register in the human brain with roughly twice the intensity of equivalent gains. This is not a cultural artifact. It is how the mind is built. So when the offer comes, the brain is not doing arithmetic. It is doing grief. The question it's actually asking is not whether the price is fair. The question is what cannot be replaced by any amount of money. You can buy a newer car. A better car. A car with all the things the old one no longer has. But you cannot purchase the specific texture of who you were while you were driving it. You cannot buy back continuity. You cannot put a number on what it cost to get through the years that car witnessed. That asymmetry is why the transaction always feels wrong even when the logic says otherwise. But there is something else operating underneath all of this. Something that doesn't get named often enough. Some people keep their old cars because of what keeping them running says about who they are. Every repair is evidence. Every problem diagnosed and solved is a small, private confirmation that this person understands how things work, that they stayed with difficulty long enough for it to yield, that they are not the kind of person who replaces what they can fix. In a culture that defaults to disposal, that is quietly radical. The knowledge lives below language. Ask someone how they knew the engine was failing and they'll pause and say it just felt wrong. They're not being imprecise. They're reporting accurately. The skill is embodied, stored in pattern recognition and accumulated attention, built across years of standing in front of problems that did not cooperate until they did. There is real pride in that. The quiet kind. The kind that has nothing to prove because it has already proved itself, incrementally, in circumstances that were not asking for an audience. The people on the outside tend to misread all of this. They see the refusal and diagnose irrationality. They see the attachment and call it sentimentality. They look at the rust and the failing parts and calculate depreciation and wonder what is wrong with this person. But they are evaluating an object that stopped being an object years ago. They are applying a financial framework to something that was never primarily financial. When they say the car isn't worth keeping, what the owner hears, underneath the practical argument, is a verdict on everything the car represents. The years. The effort. The self that was being built during all of it. To call the car worthless is, in the felt experience of the person holding onto it, to call all of that worthless. The conversation goes nowhere because the two people are not having the same conversation. Step back far enough and something larger comes into focus. Everything around us is built for replacement. Every product has a successor. The entire logic of the economy runs on the idea that holding on is a failure of judgment, that newer is progress, that the rational person always takes the better offer. And yet there are people who stand in their driveways and say no. Not because they haven't thought it through. Because they have, through a different set of values, a different calculus, one in which continuity and earned competence and the weight of lived time are not sentimental weaknesses but actual things. Real inputs. Worth protecting. What a person refuses to sell tells you something that what they buy never can. So here is the question worth sitting with. What is the thing in your life you would refuse to give up, not because of what it's worth, but because of what it holds? What it proves. What it would cost you, internally, quietly, in ways no one else would see, to let it go. The answer is not really about the object. It never was.